This is the most relaxing man who ever lived. The soft voice, the happy little trees, the gentle reminder that there are no mistakes, only happy accidents. But 20 years before any of this, the United States Air Force had a different name for him. They called him Bust 'em Up Bobby. His job was to scream at people, to make grown men scrub latrines and stand to attention. He was, by his own description, the meanest man on the base. This is the story of how the angriest job in the world built the calmest man on television. And the secret he hid right up until the very end. Robert Norman Ross was born on the 29th of October, 1942 in Daytona Beach, Florida. His father was a carpenter, his mother a waitress. And from very early on, it was clear that Bob was never really a classroom kind of kid. He felt at home in two places, his father's workshop and outdoors with animals. As a boy, he rescued injured creatures and nursed them back to health: armadillos, snakes, alligators, and especially squirrels. Decades later, one of them would end up living in his pocket on national television. His mother taught him that love of wild things, and it never left him. Even at the height of his fame, he kept rescuing injured squirrels and letting them recover in his own home. But the workshop is where the first turning point came. Bob dropped out of school in the 9th grade to work full-time alongside his father. And one day, working with the saw, there was an accident. He lost part of his left index finger. It could have ended a painting career before it ever began. Instead, Bob simply learned to hold his palette so a camera would never see it, a small, quiet secret he kept for the rest of his life. But carpentry wasn't his future. At 18, the gentle boy who rescued baby squirrels did the last thing you'd expect. He walked into a recruiting office and joined the military. In 1961, Bob Ross enlisted in the United States Air Force. At 6'2" with flat feet, they never put him near a cockpit. Instead, he was handed a desk as a medical records technician. But the Air Force doesn't only need clerks, it needs people to keep order. And Bob turned out to be frighteningly good at it. He rose to the rank of Master Sergeant, serving as the first sergeant of the base clinic. In plain terms, that made him the enforcer, the disciplinarian. In his own words, he was the guy who makes you scrub the latrine, the guy who makes you make your bed, the guy who screams at you for being late to work. The man who would one day whisper to millions had a nickname back then: Bust 'em Up Bobby. He spent 2 decades being the loudest, hardest voice in the room, and he hated it. So he made himself a promise that if he ever got out, he would never raise his voice again. Not at anyone, for as long as he lived. But the Air Force also handed Bob a gift he never saw coming, because they stationed him in Alaska. And Alaska would change everything. At Eielson Air Force Base near Fairbanks, Bob saw something Florida had never shown him: snow, towering mountains, endless frozen forests under enormous skies. Those landscapes would one day fill almost every painting he ever made. To earn a little extra, he tended bar part-time and wandered into his first art class at the USO Club in Anchorage. But Bob was frustrated. The instructors only talked theory. They'd tell you what makes a tree, he said, but they wouldn't tell you how to paint a tree. And then one day he saw it on television: a German painter named Bill Alexander. Alexander didn't lecture, he attacked the canvas. Using a centuries-old method called wet on wet, he finished an entire glowing landscape in under 30 minutes, right before your eyes. Bob was mesmerized. He studied that technique obsessively until he had mastered it. He couldn't afford fancy supplies, so he learned to do everything with a handful of big brushes, a palette knife, and a short list of colors. The same stripped-down kit he'd later hand to millions of beginners. He began painting Alaskan scenes on the backs of gold mining pans and selling them to tourists. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The money Bob made from painting started to outgrow his salary from the Air Force. For the first time, he could see a way out. In 1981, after 20 years of service, Bob Ross retired from the Air Force for good. He went home to Florida and tracked down Bill Alexander himself, studying directly under the man whose show had changed his life, and joining his company as a traveling teacher. And here is where the soft-spoken legend was actually born. Bill Alexander taught with a booming, theatrical, German-accented voice. So when Bob built his own style, he made a deliberate choice. He would be the opposite. Where Alexander shouted to a crowd, Bob would murmur, gently, as if speaking to one single person sitting right beside you. The whisper was no accident. It was Bust 'em Up Bobby finally becoming everything he'd promised to be. Then a woman named Annette Kowalski walked into one of his classes and saw what the world hadn't yet. She was certain Bob could carry a show of his own. So Annette, her husband, and Bob and his wife pooled their savings and started a tiny company with a hopeful name, Bob Ross Incorporated. At first, it barely survived. But in 1983, a small public television station in Muncie, Indiana, gave the soft-spoken painter with the strange permed hair a chance and switched on the cameras. The show was called The Joy of Painting, and almost nothing about Bob's appearance on it was an accident, except the one thing everyone remembers: that famous perm. Bob's hair was naturally straight. He'd had it permed years earlier for a purely practical reason: to save money on haircuts. But once that cloud of curls became the logo of his company, he was trapped. He could never change it again, and by most accounts he quietly grew to hate it. He worked at a punishing pace, recording up to 3 half-hour episodes in a single day, finishing a complete painting in each one. Over 11 years, he made more than 400 of them. He painted every picture on the show 3 separate times, once to plan it, once on camera, and once in detail for the companion book, which means the real number of paintings behind those 400 episodes runs into the thousands. And here's the part almost nobody knows. Bob Ross was never actually paid for appearing on The Joy of Painting. The show wasn't his income, it was an advertisement. Every episode existed to send people toward his classes, his books, and his branded supplies. That business would eventually earn millions. But Bob himself never chased the money. He gave paintings away constantly. He donated his work to public television. And he poured everything into convincing nervous, ordinary beginners of one simple, radical idea: that anybody at all, could make something beautiful. And the whole time the cameras rolled, the happiest man on television was carrying a secret he had told almost no one. In 1994, Bob Ross was diagnosed with lymphoma. He was a fiercely private man, and he kept it almost entirely to himself. He kept painting for as long as his body would let him. And when chemotherapy began taking his hair, he quietly wore a wig on set, so that the millions of people who counted on him to feel calm would never have to worry. The final episode of The Joy of Painting aired in May of 1994, and on the 4th of July, 1995, Bob Ross died. He was just 52 years old. For years afterward, he was almost forgotten, until a new generation found his old episodes online and fell completely in love. Today, Bob Ross is more famous than he ever was in life. The patron saint of calm, watched by millions who weren't even born when he died. And if you go back to where we started, to Bust 'em Up Bobby, the screaming sergeant who swore he'd never raise his voice again, you realize his whole second life was him keeping that promise. A man who once made people afraid spent the rest of his days making sure no one ever felt afraid, or rushed, or not good enough ever again. There are no mistakes in this story, only one very happy accident. If you enjoyed this one, the channel is full of stories like Bob's, ordinary people who became unforgettable. Subscribe, and I'll keep them coming. Thanks for watching.